Hi, I'm Adam Thompson. I have a studio called Emotion Theory, and I do a bit of everything. I've previously made a meditative parkour platforming game called Satori on Steam, and I'm now working on a first-person narrative adventure based on Beauty and the Beast. I'm from Auckland, and yes, I do feel there's quite a tightly knit community in games. There's a bunch of different meetups that are available to people in Auckland, and I feel it's really open and inviting for people to be a part of that, sort of an inclusive space. I feel maybe we could broaden it out a bit, but I do feel a general sense of community, yeah. An idea I have is to break away from the mold of what we think games are. I think we use the word game as just sort of like a term that we're familiar with. When you take the word game quite literally, it's like you've got goals and you've got, there are rules, win state and so on. So I think a lot of, what we call interactive entertainment may not necessarily fit quite neatly into what games typically are or historically has been. So I think to not really necessarily think of games, but rather the medium itself, which is an interactive medium, and to think on what we want to ultimately communicate. How can we use interactivity to best effectively communicate that? Games are such a mainstream medium, such a mainstream thing. So many people are playing and consuming and experiencing games. It's a really good way to have a huge cultural reach. And there's a sort of allure and fun to games that I think is very inviting to people. And I think we can kind of take advantage of that allure to provide impactful, meaningful, valuable experiences beyond just the fun entertainment. That might be why we arrived here in the first place. I have to commend the industry. I think there's been an enormous amount of progress in the last 10 or so years, more so in even the last 5. So ultimately, I think there's still more work to do and we have to keep going. We can't ever be satisfied, I think, with the progress we have made. But having said that, I do want to give credit to the progress that's been made. Personally, games aren't too social for me. I do find them a bit of an isolating experience. I don't game too much with people. The games that I do play with people, multiplayer games, I find them more of like an addicting vice and not so social. That is, however, my very personal experience. In terms of social change, one of the things I'm trying to champion is how to not always fall on games as a form of escapism, because as much as I think it can be valuable in that sense, I think we need to kind of stay healthy and remain balanced, and games can also be can negatively impact somebody in that way. I've not immersed myself fully into the space of NFTs, and I do think the metaverse kind of idea is becoming quite big. Games are becoming more mainstream. People are always flocking and gravitating towards spaces that aren't too saturated. So I think we're going to see a larger increase of VR games, especially as devices become more mainstream as well, and perhaps in these other spaces that I've mentioned as well. Not sure how that's disruptive. Maybe it will change the way we make games. Alright, yeah, I do have something to say on that. I think we've made enormous progress on the way we view a lot of cultural issues. I'm not quite convinced that we've made leaps and strides in our relationship with violence. I still think, this is a subjective perspective, but I still think that we gravitate towards violence as a default kind of game idea. I feel that we try to put a lot of personal identity and values and stuff, but based around a conventional game about combat. I still think there's been an enormous development in how we develop combat mechanics and stuff. We're quite evolved and sophisticated in combat, and I'd like to see less of that, because again, when you take intellectual properties and ideas and stuff and you try to gamify them, we tend to just make combat-driven games. I would like to see more development in other spaces that's not just combat. I'd like to have other areas that are as sophisticated and where there's an abundance of resources as much as there is with combat. It's being able to experience a story at my own pace in a non-linear sense. You know, there are authored stories that I'm experiencing. The manner in which I experience it, there's a bit of my own self put into that. And I think it can be more effective than just simply being told a story in a linear medium. I just have a disdain for violence as just a natural thing, like it's just, again, it's just like a default thing. So we might have stories about treasure hunting or family or these like very beautiful kind of ideas, but they're centered around a game based on combat. And I suppose it's been talked about to death, but ludonarrative dissonance, which is basically that the gameplay language and the language told in the authored story are not quite congruent. So yeah, it's kind of like I roll my eyes when there's that. I do think games are becoming more mainstream. I think our young generation of kids gravitate towards games. There's a natural allure and excitement to games, and I think therefore what we put into these games are having an impact on people. Like this younger generation is growing into the generation that will be tomorrow. Therefore, I think it's important for us. I think I would go so far as to say we even have an obligation to ensure that the values we're portraying in these games are such that these kids who are molded by these experiences, we need to be mindful of that. And I also think we may as well be putting in good values in these games so that we can raise a generation of kids raised on these video games, right?